Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. Don't think in movements, think in your backyard, like that this is a place where conservatives can do exactly that.
As important as it is to make some noise against the big platforms right now, even more important is to start figuring out how to best regulate the new technologies and how not to regulate them, and how to do so with an eye toward keeping the American people, recognizably a people, recognizably American, and recognizably free.
I think it does remain to be seen to what extent those powers and rights will be respected, and then also to what extent Republicans will stand their ground.
Yes, they are the paper of record, but so was Pravda, and nobody believed Pravda.
And so he's essentially saying the Taliban, in many ways, is Red America.
It's happening like constantly. Everything just keeps repeating as farce, and so it becomes impossible to take it very seriously. So, they already had an impeachment, and now they're doing another one. I mean, they weren't even fired up over that other one.
Since antiquity, this has been the logical consequence of sophistry and moral relativism, that it produces politics of pure force. And that's what this is. This is the use of whatever rhetoric and whatever equivalences you can and want to draw so that you can be justified, as they say, in making the weaker argument the stronger, and making yourself, the physically stronger, dominate. So it's Thrasymachus all the way down.
Welcome, everyone, to the Roundtable, the publisher and editor's podcast here at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind. And I'm happy to welcome a new podcast member, Seth Barron, managing editor of the American Mind. We've been teasing David Barr's move over into communications, now our senior director of communications. Barr is going to join us a little less frequently, and Seth's going to join us more frequently. It's easy to come more than ever. So we welcome Seth Barron to the team, to the podcast. I'm joined as well by James Pullis, executive editor of the American Mind, and Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the American Mind and the Claremont Review books. We were joking, Matt Peterson's not here because he's out in Texas living the free life, probably eating a steak in some restaurant with his children unmasked, and we envy him, but we'll get Matt back soon. I thought we'd start today with my favorite governor at the moment, Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, the third largest state in the union, announced a series of or plans today for some pushback against big tech, or against what he called the Big Tech Cartel. I just want to highlight a few of those, and then we can get into a discussion of it. This theme, of course, brings up some nice and interesting debates on the right between libertarians, conservatives, nationalists, etc., arguing both about means and ends. Part of what he outlined in this press conference, which displayed, as usual, his pretty intelligent and fast on his feet handling of the press and Q&A, and somewhat hostile, as everyone should be these days, to the mainstream media. It would lay out $100,000 daily fines for deep platforming candidates in office or for office, and create a cause of action pathway to sue. He's a little vague on how exactly, either through the Attorney General or by private citizens. He wants to shore up Floridians' ability to know what the platforms are doing in a transparent way. And I think most importantly, he said, I'm committed to addressing what may be one of the most pervasive threats to American self-government in the 21st century. I think that's a point that the libertarians sometimes don't appreciate when merely saying these are private companies and they can do what they like. We've talked about on this podcast before about how this is really, it's not the whole public square. These are pieces of the public square digitally, and we have to look at them, I think, a little differently than we would a normal media company, as they're the place where increasingly citizens deliberate about their government and interact with even candidates about their government. So it's a forum for deliberation about self-government, and so it needs to be treated, I think, a little differently than we would a normal private company. just doing A, Y, or X, Y, or Z. So I think this is a great development. I'm almost tempted to say that I'd like 1,000 flowers to bloom on this sort of thing, and for governors to start experimenting and to see the reactions of the tech companies, to adapt and learn from it. I don't think there's any one right way to fix all this. There are reasons to be skeptical of Section 230 reform. There's reasons to be skeptical of the national antitrust approach. I think we should allow for some experimentation here and the vigorous pursuit of citizen self-interest by governors, especially in large states where they have some real resources at their disposal and some real pull.
That part of it's really interesting to me. It's part of a just more general development in COVID that it seems like state governors, especially governors of sort of swing states or large states, have gained this sudden sort of just star status, this star quality. Like, you know, Andrew Cuomo was out there winning Emmys for his handling, his disastrous handling of COVID. But, you know, every state has this very visible high stakes response to the pandemic, and it's creating this weird kind of neo-federalism. Like suddenly the idea that you're proposing, Ryan, that states could be laboratories again of actual, you know, differing approaches to the major challenges that we face going forward is like alive in a way that it hasn't been in a long time. And obviously, I'm like much more bullish about a DeSantis or a Nome than I am about a Gavin or a Cuomo. My own question here is like, because of the phenomenon that you identify, which is that there that tech companies are different and wield a different kind of sway over speech than companies in the past have. I sort of wonder whether the legal infrastructure currently exists for DeSantis to pursue this policy effectively. Like, will he just face sort of court challenges that are successful because like what we really need here is legislation? And does it matter? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe this is kind of his audition for how he would handle this as president. Maybe it's something from which other states will take cues. But I'm kind of interested to see where that's going to go.
Yeah, I think there's the federal preemption question comes into play here. You know, these tech companies are like the railroads. The infrastructure that they move across, so to speak, is transcontinental and interstate. So traditionally, Congress has the preeminent purview over that, following the Constitution. So I think he may have a federal court injunction in his future. Then again, it often depends on the courts. And so, that'll definitely be part of it. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that there would be some court activity around really anything like this, and this in particular. DeSantis is making a point of being very vocal and public about it. And from the standpoint of politics rather than law, just because you don't know exactly where to hit the boxer opposite you in order to drop them and get the KO doesn't mean that you don't just start swinging and see what you can do. And I think to a degree, what we're seeing is DeSantis opening the door for others, as he suggested, to shake the tree and to regain the initiative and to reshape kind of the terrain of political conflict around tech in favorable terms. The movement lefties have done a pretty thorough job of honing their arguments against the technocrats, even if sometimes they think that they can capture the technocrats, and sometimes they can, but it's still contested. Google is still trying to drop their woke ethical AI people from the company. So to a degree, even though tech is large and in charge in some ways, in other ways it's still quite not. And the balance of power among right, left, and tech that is up for influence and up for control is something that probably won't be settled for a little bit. And so during that time, DeSantis is, I think, just going to be the first of many to start making explicit stands at the state level on regulating technology.
Yeah, I sort of agree. I mean, it seems like in this particular case, I can't imagine DeSantis having a lot of success. But I mean, my new sort of catchphrase is going to be devolution, not revolution. I would love to see states, whether it's as laboratories or whatever, just states using this moment to, take a little more control over their own destiny. I mean, the only problem is states' rights seems to work on the left. It doesn't really work, so it's not favored for the right. But look, if DeSantis or Nome can really, pull some of this off, it would certainly be salutary.
That's encouraging as a concept for those of us who have just recently moved to red states. I mean, Matt and I both, I think, part of our calculus in coming out here to Tennessee and to Texas, it was the at least hope that there would be a stopgap and like a sort of state firewall against the predations of the federal government, which are coming thick and fast. And yeah, Seth, I think it does remain to be seen to what extent those powers and rights will be respected, and then also to what extent Republicans will stand their ground. I think we do have a bit of a problem in that area too, of the left is happy to create actual sanctuary cities, with like unblushingly and with that name. And I wonder whether Republicans have the stones to create sanctuary cities or states for, for free speech related persecutions, for sort of racialized policies that are going to come out of this administration. I sure hope so. And I think it's a good argument for Republicans and conservatives to actually get sort of more invested than they may be inclined usually to be in local politics. But yeah, we'll be sheltering out here in Tennessee under the guardianship of our state legislature, I hope.
Yeah, I would just briefly add too that even more important than how the technology of the moment is regulated is how future technology is regulated, or really I should say technology that achieves maturity very soon is going to be regulated. Social media is not the extent of it, and we can already see, the other side ceding the ground of the press with reported pieces about whether or not private messaging apps are the new hotspot for misinformation. There is an active group that is going to come after, again, encryption, again, Bitcoin, that's going to come after the digital tools that are best designed to help ordinary Americans take shared control of their neighborhoods, of their cities, of their states, and really, regain political agency and citizenship at a time when way too many Americans are kind of resigning themselves to the idea that they don't really practice citizenship at all. Like maybe they vote once every 2 or 4 years. Maybe they yell at each other on the internet. Maybe they change their Instagram avatars to represent the symbol of the day. But beyond that, they really don't do anything. As important as it is to make some noise against the big platforms right now, even more important is to start figuring out how to best regulate the new technologies and how not to regulate them, and how to do so with an eye toward keeping the American people, recognizably a people, recognizably American, and recognizably free.
What do you think, James, are you mentioned a couple, so maybe this is a question you've already answered, but, from my fairly tech illiterate perspective, what looks important to me are servers, ownership of servers, and then the sort of blockchain currencies that you identified, and some form of communication that can operate on those servers that's protectable and also of producing, like content that's generated for a larger audience. Is there a blind spot that we've got in this domain right now in your view, something we ought to be focusing on that we're not?
I mean, the ones that you identified are definitely at the top of the list. The one that I would add has to do with weaponry. We are going to be looking at a serious expansion of the capabilities of autonomous weapons of all sizes, ranging from twirling above the Earth in orbit to, nanobots, potentially. There are questions about weapons that apply to 3D printing, that apply to drones. There are finally, I think, going to be some technologies in the near future that shift the balance between offense and defense back toward defense. We've been in a very offense-heavy sort of military technology mode for a while. And things will really start to get medieval if technology gives people a genuine chance at mounting a solid defense of their township or their county or their state. That would be a big deal. Many people laugh at Second Amendment folks for acting as if, I have my rifle, so if the government comes, I'll be able to defend myself and they laugh at that idea. And to a degree, of course, that's sort of repulsive, and that kind of mockery is willfully obtuse, but at the same time, there is a certain truth to the fact that the technology of weaponry we have really, really strongly favors massive offensive firepower and really doesn't favor defense the way that it did when you could build castles or trench warfare was a thing. So I think that's going to change, and I think it's going to be relevant to people's lives, especially if chaos and unlawfulness and disorder continues to spread through the country. And probably a layer of paranoia all around, as if the more that cancel culture morphs into dox culture and rat culture, and selling your parents out to the regime because they said something at home that was unauthorized, the more people are going to regain or develop an interest in the military and personal protection aspects of tech.
Do you mean to tell me, James, that the rifle that I just acquired after long effort to protect my home is going to be insufficient to meet the challenges of the digital age? I'm very disappointed about that.
I think that it is a good start.
Okay, that makes me feel better.
Some of us were at a closed-door conference in Las Vegas on the question of big tech a couple, 2.5, 3 weeks ago. And I want to raise two things from it and see what we think of it. One of our, it was all off the record, so I won't mention any names besides the one name who doesn't care and who said this much publicly, and that's Ken Paxton, Attorney General in Texas, who's suing Google, and was also very proud to have been the first AG to win an injunction against the Biden administration recently, but not about big tech, of course. So Paxton's point was, we're suing Google for, I think it was basically for anti-competitive / unfair trade practices, and maybe some false advertisement. Don't quote me on all that, but everyone can go look it up. But one of Paxton's point that was pretty interesting was, look, I've got we've got maybe 6-7 lawyers working on this, and we are completely outgunned budget-wise and manpower-wise by, one of the world's largest companies, $1 trillion plus market cap companies. So we need help was part of his plea to the lawyers in the room and the people who are connected to networks that would be in a position to help. So that whole dynamic will be very interesting. We'll see how much of a Goliath Google is, and we'll see how apt the comparisons to Standard Oil are. That will be one thing to watch. And then the other thing too, which I thought it's more of a sociological point about our current cultural political environment. And one of our presenters said, look, there's going to be limited traction for going after the Jack Dorseys and the Mark Zuckerbergs through legal tactics or even Section 230. Section 230, he thought the legal architecture, the court architecture for it, handling a bunch of lawsuits, if we were to reform 230, didn't seem to him to be a great way of turning these big companies from bad behavior. He thought it would be long court battles, which the tech companies can afford and which would be resolved years and years down the line. And then he also said, look, you can't affect Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg's behavior through these legal means that quickly, nor can you through hearings at Congress by upset Republican senators or other things like that. These men answer to the dominant purveyors of our culture and influencers of our culture these days. And the two main power sources in that regard are the most prestigious universities, and especially their latest critical race theory fads and humanities fads, and the extent to which those theories shape how we conduct ourselves in public. And then the New York Times. It's basically big media and big university. They're the ones that the Jack Dorseys and the Zuckerbergs are responding to, partly because all of their young woke employees exert pressure from below, and also because the narrative from the top, from Washington, from New York, emanates from those sorts of places in diffuse ways. I thought that was a pretty interesting point. It's one that I think we've all seen in operation in real time in recent years. The one example that came up was Hawley can bemoan all he wants. The rise of the amount of abusive videos and possibly sex traffic influenced content on Pornhub, but you get one New York Times op-ed about it, and some real action happens without any actual threat of legislation from legislators, but just Pornhub deciding they're going to remove thousands and hundreds of thousands of videos because they're scared of the New York Times's cultural clout. So a lot to chew on there, but I thought those two things were pretty interesting that came out of that conference, and are things we should watch and think about.
It does speak to something pretty important that's been much on my mind, at least lately, which is, doing this podcast and the various other venues on the American Mind website, when we read the comments on our Substack and things of that nature. One of the questions that repeatedly comes up when you launch into grand theory of capital H, how bad things are, is you get, well, so what? Like, what are we going to do about it? And often that comes in the form of a cri de coeur, expressing despair about just a sense of helplessness, a sense that the powers that people are up against are so vast that there's really nothing that any individual can do about, like, the federal government, especially now that it is in the hands of the Democrat Party. And the more that I think about it, the more I think, you're kind of right. Like, you are right that you're thinking about problems which are not directly susceptible to your personal intervention. And there is a certain degree of resignation in that, but there's also freedom, because it does allow you to, like, look around you and think about what you can do, that is not going, like, the sweeping creation of a new national party overnight, or the taking back of the Capitol via some sort of half-brained scheme. Like, those things are shown now to be counterproductive and also are misguided as efforts. And it seems like the kind of stuff that you're talking about, Ryan, is a good example of a dimension in which, like, groundswell movements really do make a difference, and, like, personal choices lead to community choices, lead to larger movements, and the cultural power that places like the Ivy Leagues and the New York Times hold is in part institutionalized and in part financial, but it is also based on audience and based on people's responses to and regard for these institutions. Even after they've recognized the way that they've failed us, people still, I think, afford them a certain degree of honor and a certain attention that they simply no longer deserve. And that is somewhere where, at least in your own sphere, you can be kind of restructuring your habits and your life in the same way that, like, an environmentalist would tell you to think small and, like, start a garden. And this is like the Wendell Berry refrain is, don't think in movements, think in your backyard. Like, that this is a place where conservatives can do exactly that.
Yeah, I agree with you there, Spencer. And, to a certain extent, yes, the New York Times, their power is it's unbelievable, and it's incredible, because, like, 10 years ago, it seemed like they were the failing New York Times, and now there's absolutely crescent. But at the same time, the mask, they've sort of removed their mask. So it's hard to, yes, they are the paper of record, but so was Pravda, and nobody believed Pravda. So in a sense, it's become much easier to ignore the New York Times in a way, because it's become so much clearer that it's hard to believe it. They don't really publish news. Everything is just reported opinion. They in headlines, they say, oh, so-and-so's lies. I mean, they didn't used to headline things that way with, blatant opinionating. So it's interesting that it does give us space in which to ignore them, even though they're so dominant. It's like under the Soviet Union, people knew what Pravda said, and it was just taken for granted that it was ludicrous. I think 20, 30 years ago, people afforded the New York Times more, there was an assumption that, well, I don't like the way they cover the news, but they are covering it. And there's a certain truth that they're expressing, or that there's a certain reality that they're expressing. I think a lot of people now just assume that everything in the New York Times is nonsense.
Yeah, the news used to be at least slightly helpful in orienting yourself in the lived social space. Sometimes it was essential. And now we know that the New York Times and the Academy are both basically engaged in the process of disseminating juicy narratives and getting people to subscribe to those narratives. Yeah, there are science departments, but even many science departments have been completely co-opted by juicy narrative making. And then at the Times, there are still some news reporters who go out there and are on the ground in places where at this point almost no other publication is. And they do stuff, but sometimes they get it wrong. Times had to retract some high profile pieces that were supposed to be, real reported news. And that was an embarrassment to them, but everyone's already largely forgotten already because they read it for the juicy narratives. And so if digital tools are going to finish the job of overthrowing the rule of juicy narrative, then there are going to be a lot of faithful, in this case, almost reactionaries, but they'd be reactionaries at the left, faithful subscribers to those juicy narratives, who are not 85 years old, but are, 25, 35, 45, and all the way up. And they don't want the New York Times to become less influential. They don't want the Academy to be less influential. Those institutions made them who they are. And they're prepared to fight for control over the culture long after the institutions that control it have been eclipsed by new forms.
The direction the conversation is taking does raise another issue, which is like that we can add, I think, to the list of tech desiderata that we just drew up. We could add two kind of like meat space, as the very online say, as in real life desiderata, which are reporters and somewhat less urgently, but still, importantly, scholars and independent researchers. I mean, these are two things that the right still, despite our really impressive efforts in the movement to create alternative sources of journalism and commentary, we are still parasitic to some degree. And I include us in this, although I don't really think this is quite our job or our mission. But we are, we take the budget from AP and from the New York Times. They still have us vastly outnumbered in terms of people who actually go out and get the information that previously only a handful of locals knew about. And there are very notable exceptions to that. Andy Ngo is one good example. And some of these Twitch journalists who emerged in summer of last year. But this is another thing that, if people are out there throwing around vast sums of money or endowing various chairs at various institutes, this is something that we could really work on.
Yeah, and it's partly a problem of the market as well. It's a lot more expensive to do real news in the U.S., let alone internationally, than it is to do narrative construction. I mean, I don't know the actual headline, but if you all, our listeners, just go to look at the reporting, quote unquote, reporting from the New York Times on the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's recent thing about experiencing trauma because she was in her office, not in the Capitol, which was originally claimed, although I don't know, it was claimed in the New York Times piece, but it was left pretty vague, in her actual office, which was in one of the House office buildings, which was not actually in the Capitol, but across the street. Just look at how they report it. I mean, it's basically a rehash of her live Instagram feed that she did for 30 minutes talking about her past sexual trauma and about how she was re-triggered and about how she'd heard someone saying, where is she? Where is she? As she was hiding in her office, and it turned out to just be a Capitol Hill police officer. But he was nonetheless seemed sort of menacing, and that was triggering in a way, or half triggering, or it was kind of it was left hung in the air to be drawn as triggering by the readers. And then it sort of runs through her recent conflicts with Senator Cruz and tweets about it. And there's no attempt to interview the Capitol Hill police officer who broke into her, not broke in, but tried to clear her out of the building for a thing completely separate from the Capitol Hill riot. Take that and then go look at a reported story about some medium scale political incident in DC, some from say 40 years ago, and you'll see the palpable difference between how journalism, quote unquote, is conducted today and how it used to be conducted. It used to rest on a lot of people doing shoe leather reporting, making lots of phone calls, lots of fact checking. I mean, this whole pyramid of people leading up to the point of the story, the point of that pyramid being the story. And now it's probably some person under 30 sort of trolling social media, conferring with some colleagues and padding the thing. And then you have your juicy narrative, as James said. Well, good. I'm glad I stupefied with everyone with that one.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the breathless nature with which reporters on social media related Ocasio-Cortez's live Instagram feed, detailing like all of her feelings and all of her thoughts about what was happening to her. I mean, it's so absurd. And the fact that she wasn't actually in the Capitol, I don't think most people really gather that because, but you're right. I mean, almost no legislators have offices within the Capitol building. They're all in office buildings nearby. So it's so weird that she's been given this platform to come up with this crazy narrative. But at the same time, it almost seems as though she's, I feel like the blush is off the rose. Like, if she's driven to this point to just fabricate things and kind of publish her strange neuroses to the world, that sort of indicates that maybe she feels like she's losing control of the narrative. I don't know. She definitely seems like she's kind of lost it.
I wonder, Seth, whether part of what you're observing is just a consequence of the progressive way in which we are hardening into our scripted reactions to these sorts of events. When AOC emerged on the scene, she was obviously this very gifted social media rhetorician, but also somewhat ignorant and kind of proto-despotic and sort of self-proclaimed socialist and all of these things that made conservative hackles raise. And now, I certainly agree that this feels bland, this latest kind of spat. And largely it feels bland because I can almost write for you a TikTok of the future in which the various reactions will unfold and are unfolding. And they're all unfolding exactly the way, everybody who is kind of a devotee of her brand will click like and will find it abhorrent that conservatives would question this narrative. Those who, as James said, are there for the narrative will be unreached by Jack Posobiec or whoever pointing out with careful reporting the sort of distinction between her story and the truth. I kind of feel, to me, it feels as if everybody is just waiting for what the next thing is. Like this dance feels really stale at this point. And one of the themes of this podcast since its beginning has been we have an interest in conspiracy theories. We started out talking about Joseph Epstein. And we've chatted about QAnon and Pizzagate and all of this stuff.
That's Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah. Did I say Joseph?
You did.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. All right. Wow. Amazing.
At least I wasn't
just reading Joseph Epstein for the latest CRB. So that's probably why. Maybe I'll go back. So Jake, if you want, you can or analyst if
No, it's too good. We got to keep it.
We got to keep it. All right.
Gold.
So Joseph,
gold.
We began with Joseph Epstein, who also didn't kill himself. I mean, to be perfectly fair. But
Jeffrey.
No. So Jeffrey Epstein and conspiracy theories. Where was I? That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, one of our recurring themes has been that even though we are not followers of Q or believers in Pizzagate, or I'll speak at least for myself, we nevertheless can totally see why, if you are not a person with a lot of information at his or her fingertips, or an abundant amount of free time to spend trolling the internet, trawling it for factoids and back chat rooms, then it's completely understandable that you would opt for this fabricated narrative over the one that is also plainly fabricated, that continually is disproven factually false in its particulars, because you happen to think that this one is at least closer to representing what is really going on. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. And I sort of feel as if that too has now become hardened into this carapace of everybody has some kind of heuristic into which they fit every new development, but nobody really, except in a few cases, feels like they have unmediated access to what's going on, which would be the next development, is if somebody could come along and actually do reporting and deliver the news.
Well, yeah, I think Seth is quite right that we've entered into this strange little mini sequence in what feels like an interregnum, where it's not entirely clear how strong or how weak the regime is based on its own conduct. I mean, when you are shouting your trauma into your Instagram and accusing your political enemies of spectral assault, it is not clear whether that is an act that betokens strength or weakness on the part of your faction. When the entire District of Columbia is shut down and ringed with concertina wire and lined with National Guardsmen and women, some of whom were mostly, it seemed, lounging around, laying on the floor, reading Atlas Shrugged, if social media was any indication. That is not clearly a sign of strength or weakness of the regime. It seems to be a strange mix of both. Especially against the backdrop of the renegotiation of the social contract around technology and the ratcheting up of the rhetoric, there are still billboards around the country, I guess, soliciting information about January 6th. There are still, mighty blue checks on Twitter raving about how January 6th needs to be the occasion for everything from a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to a new sort of war on terror to God knows what else. None of these things, although they're all sort of alarming and a smack of trouble, it's not clear that they're signs that the regime is quite as strong as usually a regime is when it acts in such a crazy way.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I mean, another example of the apparent, weakness of AOC's position is that I think a lot of this is in response to the fact that her insistence that Ted Cruz tried to have her murdered and that she wanted him kicked out of the Senate clearly just got no traction. And I suspect probably even within her own party, people were like, well, let's not push it. But, in terms of the staleness of the response, I think we've seen that in a lot of things. Biden and Harris came into power. They overthrew Trump. The monster is gone. Yet they don't seem very excited about it. They don't seem very happy. It's Black History Month. But in a sense, the last 6 or 8 months have been so focused on BLM and Black excellence. How much more pumped up can Black History Month be this year? It's almost like, Marx's quip about history repeating as farce. It's become almost iterative, and it's like compound interest. It's happening constantly. Everything just keeps repeating as farce, and so it becomes impossible to take it very seriously. So, they already had an impeachment and now they're doing another one. It's hard to imagine that the Democrat base is going to get they weren't even fired up over that other one. This one just seems patently absurd. So I don't know. You're right. There's a weird kind of pantomime sense that's happening that doesn't bespeak confidence. Let's put it that way.
Well, and it is the case that we see juicy narratives losing their juice every day. One of the reasons why these things get ratcheted up so intensely is that, the old fix of normie news just doesn't do it anymore. And as, tech continues to do what it does to us, it gets harder and harder to break the resignation or the disinterest or the jadedness of the audience. There was a huge mobilization campaign, of course, around, just nakedly demonizing Trump. And that did ratchet people up pretty high. But, as you suggested, last year it was Black History Month. And this year it appears to be Trans Black History Month. It appears to be centering, queer BIPOC History Month. And there's always no sooner is some milestone in the unfolding of wokeness established than an even more significant and obscure and recondite milestone is established. And people are getting whipsawed. It's information overload, just without even talking about what kind of content it is. And then the content is locked into this pattern of continuous one-upmanship that leads people to begin to ask, where's the logical endpoint of this? And the reality is that when it comes to juicy narratives, there is no logical endpoint of how juicy they get. You push them as far as they can go until you have to close down the show.
Yeah, I used to think Trump was the cause of our accelerated news cycle, and that's why it seemed like we were in a political news time warp, sort of on double speed. And I think it was the reaction to Trump, of course, played a large part of it. So in that sense, he was a cause. But from what I've seen of the first month of the Biden administration, or less than a month, this does not seem to be letting up at all. And so I think we'll have more and more fodder to reflect on these themes. I wanted to, we spent a lot of time on this, but it was very interesting and worth it. So I just wanted to transition to talk of, James brought up one of the juicy narratives being using the January 6th debacle to talk about domestic extremism and even to talk about a kind of domestic war on terrorism, and using the tools of our foreign war on terrorism against this new domestic insurgency. So there's this very interesting short interview from NPR. It grows out of a New York Times article by Robert Grenier, who is the CIA station chief for Pakistan and Afghanistan in 2001, and then was the Iraq mission manager and director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center from 2004 to 2006. He wrote this piece in which he said, "We may be witnessing the dawn of a sustained wave of violent insurgency within our own country, perpetrated by our own countrymen. Without national action, extremists who seek a social apocalypse are capable of producing endemic political violence of a sort not seen in this country since Reconstruction." I just want to read a few paragraphs from the actual interview with that primer. So the host of the show, where was it? It was on All Things Considered, asked the following: "Is there anything that you think could be done with a sense of urgency?" He responds, "Part of it is simply setting the proper national tone. But another, I think, very important element that we haven't talked about yet is what I would refer to as insurgent leadership. The fact of the matter is that the most violent elements that we are concerned about right now see former President Trump as a broadly popular and charismatic symbol. He is their charismatic leader, whether he chooses to acknowledge it or not. Just as I saw in the Middle East that the air went out of violent demonstrations when Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was defeated and seen to be defeated, I think the same situation applies here. The fact of the matter is that Mr. Trump is lost. It's very important that people see that he's lost as a private citizen, but I think it's extremely important that his potency as a symbol for the most violent among us is somehow addressed." Interviewer follow-up: "Your view is that it's not enough that he was defeated at the polls, but that he must also be convicted in his Senate impeachment trial, and you argue this is a national security imperative." Response: "I think it's a national security imperative precisely because he is seen as the charismatic leader of a great many violent people, and I think that needs to be countered. So long as he is there and leading the resistance, if you will, which he shows every sign of intending to do, he is going to be an inspiration to very violent people." Skipping to the last sentence of the whole thing, this is, again, Mr. Grenier: "The difficult part of the problem is affecting the environment. within which violent elements otherwise would be able to thrive. And his analogy is actually Afghanistan here. And he says, look, there weren't that many al-Qaeda there. What we really need to do is go after the Taliban. So let me just break down a few of these things, which I think are extraordinary, and then we can all riff on it. I mean, first of all, he seems to think, we can grant his premise that Trump has a following and is charismatic. I think that's undeniable. We can deny his premise that this is fueling a lot of violence. There's yet to be much evidence of that, aside from, some Viking helmeted yahoos on January 6th. And we must grant some more serious militia types who were up to no good. That said, there's not really any widespread national evidence of plots. There were thousands of troops in the Capitol, and it was reported by more sober folks that if you sort of poked around into DHS's warning about violent extremism and the FBI's warning, there wasn't much to it. They didn't offer anything really substantive. And if you're a student of these things, these sorts of releases, it was clear that it was kind of reaching, to say the least. And his other point is, so the one thing we can do to destroy the charismatic pull of Trump is for the swamp Senate to convict him with what would have to be, a kind of rump of the Republican Party voting also to convict. And that would fix everything. I mean, that, for one thing, is a complete misreading of the political phenomenon of Trump, of his attraction to a large portion of the electorate, let alone his diehard fan base and probably 40% of the Republican Party. The notion that this would unmartyr him and sort of make him fade from the scene is insane, and just doesn't understand politics or media or comms or anything else. And then this final point, the notion that the difficult part is the problem is affecting the environment. That is, there's not much al-Qaeda. I've said that, channeling him. There's not much al-Qaeda. Law enforcement can deal with them. The real problem is the Taliban surrounding our domestic al-Qaeda, which are these pro-Trump extremists. And so he's essentially saying the Taliban, in many ways, is Red America and its infrastructure that supports both opinion and in local law and institutionally supports the violent fringe that we have to confront. I mean, this whole thing, if you read between the lines, it just strikes me as crazy, dangerous, unnecessarily inflammatory, among other problems.
I am young enough to remember being in high school during the Iraq War. And I remember my high school teachers with a certain brand of sophistry that only hotshot high school history teachers can really perfect, saying to us, well, the American Revolution was an insurgency. So aren't these freedom fighters? Isn't one man's freedom fighter really just another man's terrorist? And at the time, being something like 16, even I had the brain cells to rub together to think, well, no, because it matters what you're fighting for. But to Seth's point about the history of this stuff repeating as farce, right? This notion that tactics are the defining feature of any group of people with any set of political aims has now been spun out into this absolutely absurdist fantasy that because there isn't a clear sort of central governing body of the Trumpist movement, and because there are elements of populism involved in it, and because it arrays itself in some ways against state power, and now because there is the excuse of this one violent episode, that not only are the Taliban freedom fighters, but conservatives are the Taliban. And so, I mean, it's kind of hilarious to me, except that, as you say, Ryan, it's so incredibly dangerous. But this is, since antiquity, this has been the logical consequence of sophistry and moral relativism, that it produces politics of pure force. And that's what this is. This is the use of whatever rhetoric and whatever equivalences you can and want to draw so that you can be justified, as they say, in making the weaker argument the stronger, and making yourself the physically stronger dominate. So it's Thrasymachus all the way down.
Well, it's also funny because if you listen to what this guy had to say, it's clear that, right, just impeaching Trump and finding him guilty, that wouldn't be enough to erase his shine. They really want to do what happened to Saddam Hussein, which is to have Trump dragged out of a pipe in the ground, or like Gaddafi, and just dragged through the streets naked and brutalized and murdered. Like, they think that I think that's what they would like to see. Trump has to be utterly, like red state America has to be humiliated and violated and destroyed physically in the person of Trump. And I think they think that would then, teach everyone a lesson that this is what happens if you do what he did. I still don't really understand. I mean, this is just a little side question. If January 6th was an insurrection, if it was a putsch, if it was a true attempt to overthrow the government, how did it, what made it fail? Why did it stop? Like, who undid it? They still haven't answered that. Like, if it was a putsch, then did the armies come in and stop them? Did Nancy Pelosi give a speech and make them all go away? Or did they all just get bored and leave? Which doesn't sound like an insurrection.
And yet we are having a national stand down day among our armed forces, where each branch of the military will take. It's like when Starbucks closed all their locations because they'd made too many of them and quality was dipping. So it seems that we're actually going to be combing through all of our servicemen and women to make sure that they're not insurrectionists or something like that. It's not altogether clear what sort of demonstration of loyalty to the regime they're going to be asked to express. It's all very odd, and it's yet another one of these indicators that, is this really a show of strength? Are things really going that well for you? Do you really have confidence that you have what it takes to keep the wheels on the wagon if these are the kinds of measures that you're resorting to?
You raised a good point, Seth, which is, I mean, what was the causal mechanism that forced everyone to go home? I mean, from accounts from folks on the ground, like our friend Chris Bedford and former fellow at the Federalist, the National Guard eventually got there and started using more tear gas, some flashbangs. They dispersed the outside crowd. The indoor one kind of dissipated and left. Trump, the supposed leader of the putsch, told everyone to go home and be peaceful. People complained that it took him too long, but that was nonetheless his message repeatedly that day and the day after in preparation for the inauguration 2 weeks later. So yeah, it's it just, all of this snowballs into the conclusion that many of us have made, which is that the notion that this was a real insurrection outside of the minds of a few, sort of much too grandiose and self-confident and nonetheless delusional individuals in a couple militias, it's just laughable. And the extent to which it's just repeated ad nauseum on the mainstream media, on CNN all the time, on plenty of local news media who take their cues from the national media, that this insurrection, the insurrection, it's just, I think you're right, James. It seems to me to be a sign of some panic amongst our ruling class, and the panic has its sources not just in the fact that the physical space of where they conduct their business was breached. It seems to go a lot deeper. And I'll just add too that the other added, some wag on Twitter said something like, okay, so we're going to treat this as a domestic insurgency, and red states as the equivalent of the Taliban, or the Taliban's a good one, right? So if that's true, then our law enforcement folks who are responsible for prosecuting this problem will go into all these red states, basically muck about half competently for years, and then eventually they'll leave and hand control back over to the Reds, that is the Republicans in those states. So, and look, this Grenier guy, probably, I don't know, who knows if he's malicious and manipulative or whether he's just kind of naive and reading the domestic political moment through his already deficient lens for how we've conducted foreign policy and its purported successes and failures in the last 20 years. I don't mean to run him down, but this the overall narrative on this question is crazy, frankly. And we need to watch it carefully. And, it makes strange bedfellows, right? We're all reading Glenn Greenwald and watching him on Tucker occasionally with some nodding of the head when that would have been crazy 5 or 10 years ago, because, he, a longtime sort of anti-statist critic of military industrial complex and our conduct in our foreign wars in the last 20 years, sees this coming given the rhetoric that's being deployed, and thinks if you're going to do this domestically, it can only lead to misery and continuing civil strife. Weird times.
And no one in sight. And we've got elections coming up. Gavin Newsom is going to get recalled, maybe, possibly. And he has a challenger who is literally posting physique on Twitter.com. It's a watershed moment. He's showing off his tats and his washboard abs, and he's sharing his workout regimen. This is just the very beginning of the rejiggering of the political parties. It might come with a lot of misery. I won't sugarcoat it, but it might also come with its own share of fun.
Well, on that high note, James, we're just at about an hour, actually ending early today. So I want to thank Seth. Your debut has been excellent, and we're on time, and we look forward to doing this again and again. So thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, go to claremont.org/donate. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, and claremontreviewbooks.com. Don't forget to rate us well, please. Review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee, the production and engineering crew. And thank you to you all. We'll talk to you next week. Well, I'll bring it up in the thing. You guys can react as live. Do it live.
Do it live.
You're not allowed to take a day off, Jay.